In today's show, we're talking about wildlife photos and how you can make them more creative. Hey guys, welcome into Magnolia Photography SC. I'm Jeff House, a wildlife photographer in Charleston, South Carolina. So if you are a newer photographer or maybe a photographer who's been doing a little wildlife photography for a little while, but you look at your photos and you're like, man, I am just sick and tired of taking boring photos. What do I got to do around here to get an interesting, photo that people are just like, wow, that's amazing. Well, don't fret over it too much, okay? Because I've got 9 tips today to help you create more interesting, more engaging, more creative wildlife photos. And we're going to kick it off with tip number 1. And we've talked about this one on previous shows. But tip number 1 is worth mentioning again because it's so vital to wildlife photography. And I always like to stress when I'm talking about wildlife photography, I'm going to be talking about birds a lot. Yes, bird photography is part of wildlife photography. Obviously, there's other animals out there. Don't think I'm excluding those. I just tend to talk about bird photography a lot because that's mainly what I do. But let's talk about understanding animal behavior first and foremost, because it is so critical to getting great wildlife shots. You need to understand the animals. You need to understand why they do certain things, when they're going to do certain things, and be on the lookout for these things. There are cues. I've talked about in the past how I was photographing an osprey one time and I saw him up on the perch, waiting for him to take off, hoping he would fly towards me. And he pooped. And so I took out my phone, did whatever, right? Wasn't paying attention. Next thing I know, boom, flies right over my head, right? And I was like, what just happened there? So, I went back when I got home and looked that up and said, kind of what's going on? Like, what are some traits? What are some cues to look for from ospreys? And one of the things it said was, well, when they poop, they're going to fly, right? They tend to take off after that. It's just something they do, right? So next time that happened, I was ready to go and I caught the picture. But man, was I pissed that day when I missed the photos. These are the things that you got to be aware of. These are the things you got to do. You got to understand the birds. You got to understand their behaviors. And when you understand their behaviors, you're going to be amazed at how many more photographic opportunities come your way. It's kind of funny how it works that way, isn't it? Let's jump to tip number 2. Okay, tip number 2, it's probably going to be very obvious. You're going to be like, no crap, Jeff. But it's something that many people forget when they're out in the field doing wildlife photography. You need to be patient and you need to be persistent. And this kind of goes a little bit with number 1, right? It kind of goes hand in hand with that one. You got to be patient and persistent because animals don't work on your time. They work on their time. They're going to do what they're going to do when they want to do it, right? And you just need to be ready for it. You need to put yourself in the position to be ready for it, especially if you're doing bird photography, right? Keep in mind, you kind of want to try to avoid being downwind of birds, especially birds like waterfowl that are a little bit more sensitive when humans are around them, right? They may not be used to human interaction and just the smell of you is going to scare them off. So you don't want to be downwind, right? You don't want to be, I should say, upwind from them because they're going to smell you as your odor. The wind takes that downwind into their little world. They're gonna sense that, and they're just gonna take off, and you're gonna miss those shots. Okay, so try to approach them from a position where that's not going to happen, right? Also, you want to try to position yourself where when you're photographing birds that you are kind of upwind, and this is kind of a little bit of a battle with being undetected with your smell. But the reason is when birds take off, right, the same rules of flight apply that you take off into a headwind because it's easier to get lift, right? You get a little drag and lift. And so the birds will tend to take off into upwind. Try to position yourself for this, right? Try to figure out where the bird is going to take off. you got to be patient. You got to be persistent. You're going to get this wrong, or the bird's just not going to take off upwind for whatever reason, right? Something else is happening, causing them to take off in a certain direction, maybe just a choice. But the point is, patience and persistence will pay off in wildlife photography. You got to remember, though, keep your attention focused, because I'm telling you, the animal amazingly always seems to do something when you become impatient or you lose your persistence and you look away for a second. You look at that phone, you're looking somewhere else, you're daydreaming. Guarantee the animal is going to do something at that point. So stay focused. Tip number 3, use lighting creatively. What do you mean use lighting creatively, Jeff? We're out there. I don't have any lighting. Well, yes, we do. We have the sun. And even when it's cloudy, we still have lighting available to us. It may not be a more harsh lighting like the sun, right? Because the clouds can act as a big softbox essentially, and they give us a nice filtered light. Personally, I love shooting on cloudy days because it really makes the shooting a lot easier. You know, there's always an angle to the bird. There's always a spot on the bird when the sun is out that tends to get blown out a little bit, right? Those highlights tend to lose a little bit of detail. And so you got to find that balance in your exposure to get, you know, the majority of the bird in good lighting with your exposure in camera, and not lose too many of those highlights and not lose too many of those shadows. So shooting in that direct sunlight can always be a little bit of a challenge, but keep in mind that there are things you can do, right? Try to photograph your animals with the sun at your back, right? That means they're going to be front lit, which should mean that they're more evenly lit. If you are to the side, right? If the lighting to your bird is, or your animal is to the side of them, and you just don't have a choice, because this is going to happen sometimes, right? This is the nature of wildlife photography. We don't always have the solution at our fingertips. There might be some lands that we can't cross over. You know, I talk a lot about the lagoon I shoot at. Well, sometimes I get a lot of side lighting in the morning, but I like that in the morning when the sun angle's low. Can create a very dramatic look and feel. But as the sun gets a little bit higher and a little bit more harsh, that side lighting gets real ugly. But I'm not crossing over the lagoon to change my angle because the water is infested with alligators. So guess what? I'd rather miss the shot than miss both of my legs. So you got to look at how you can use the sun creatively, right? If it's early morning, or it's early evening when the sun is really getting down low, use the sun, use the colors, use the angle of the sun to create some interesting lighting on your subject, right, that you're photographing. If the sun is just high in the sky, again, try to keep the sun at your back as much as possible so that you're getting that light from the sun, and it's going to be more even on your subject. But don't be afraid to look at those things. Don't be afraid to use the sun as a way to light your subject, because that is all that we have when we're out there photographing wildlife. Tip number 4, compose your images in interesting ways, right? If you look at compositional techniques online, this is something that you can Google, right? You will see things like rule of thirds and filling the frame and leading lines and framing your subject. Think about this, right? If you're out there photographing a bird on a perch, right? It might be a boring photo. The bird just might be sitting there, but it might be a real cool bird, right? It might be a cool hawk or an eagle or something along those lines. And it's something you would like to have in your portfolio. Maybe it's not something that you share with the rest of the world on social media or on a website because maybe it's just not that interesting, but maybe it's just one of those photos that you'd like to have. Or maybe we can look at some compositional techniques we can use that will take that photo from just being in your personal portfolio to going on your website or to sharing on social media, right? What can we do when it comes to this? So a lot of times what I'll do when I'm out there photographing a bird, I get a lot of hawks and eagles in our area. So they might be on the perch, and they might be on the same perch that I photographed them 100 times before. But I'm always looking to find new ways to make the photo interesting. Matter of fact, I was out photographing a red-shouldered hawk this morning, and he was sitting on the same tippy-top tree branch. It's kind of like a dead tree. And so I was looking for a creative way to take that picture because I'd already, I've taken a lot of them just standing on that tree branch. And now, fortunately, the past couple of days that I've seen him, he's been yelling and doing different things. So he's been giving me good facial expressions. He was turning on the top of the branch. So, he had to flap the wings out to keep his balance. So he gave me some interesting shots. But today he was not doing that. So I kind of had to come up with a way to make the photo more interesting. So what I did was I moved my position, right? I went to around other trees that were in the area. I was shooting through tree branches that were in the foreground and placing my subject, in between those leaves. So there's like a foreground element, and then you can see the hawk sitting up on that tree branch, right? So do things like that. Vary the distance you are from the bird when they're sitting up on a perch. Very easy to get too close to the bird and you're shooting too up on them, right? You don't want that if at all possible, unless they're looking directly down at you, which they can do sometimes. But shooting up when you're closer to a bird that's higher up usually does not create the most appealing shot. So remember, just back up, right? Back your distance up so that the tilt of your camera up to your bird becomes far less. That's going to make the photo more interesting because it's not going to be so obvious that you're shooting up on a bird that's lifted high in the air on a tree. So that can be another way of going. Fill the frame. If you're using a high megapixel camera, if the bird is, if you're in a position where you can get closer to the bird, don't be afraid to fill the frame with your subject. Now you can do this through the camera. If the situation allows, if you're able to get close enough where you can zoom in and fill the frame, wonderful. But if you can't, if you have to shoot a little further away, if you have those higher megapixel cameras, 40, 45 megapixels or higher, don't be afraid to get as close as possible, take that photograph, and then later on in editing, crop it in so he fills the frame, so that bird fills the frame. Don't be afraid to do that. When you do that, you create a photo that is very intimate. The viewer will feel like they are in the scene, and it just creates a really amazing feeling. Now, on the flip side of that, guys, don't be afraid. So much of wildlife photography is zoomed in. And I love those photos, so there's nothing wrong with that. But if you want a little mix, you want to mix it up, give a different look, don't be afraid to zoom out, right? If your animal that you're photographing is in its natural environment and you can capture some other details of that environment, do that too, right? Make your subject a little smaller in the frame, but bringing them in with their environment is really going to go a long way in telling a story. Remember 3 things when you're out there shooting: shoot wide, shoot medium, and shoot tight. If you remember these things, wide, medium, and tight, you will have a nice mix of photos to make a nice story later on. So keep those tips handy because that's a great one. Tip number 5, shoot from different heights and shoot from various angles, right? This is so important. Now, you're going to be shooting, what did I just say? You're going to be shooting wide, you're going to be shooting medium, and you're going to be shooting tight. Now, when you're shooting wide, take a shot. Vary the height of your camera from wide. Vary the angle from wide. Then go to medium, right? Shoot medium. Vary your angles. Vary the height of your camera. Go tight. Vary your angles. Vary your height of camera. All we're doing is going through like this checklist of things, right? Wide, medium, tight. We vary the height of our camera. We vary the angles that we're shooting. And all of this, when you get back to the editing room later on with your photos, you're going to have a super great mix of different photos that are going to tell that story and really do a great job of capturing that animal. Tip number 6, we're going to be talking about bird photography more specifically here, but this could be applicable to other animals if they're moving quickly, if they're running or doing whatever. But use the highest frames per second that your camera allows, right? What we want to do in these situations where the animal or the bird is moving very quickly or erratically, and we want those shots captured, using the highest frames per second on your camera is going to allow you to capture the animal quite frequently, right? So that's going to be good, especially depending on the shutter speed you're using. You want to make sure that you have, a nice number of photos in focus. So use the highest frames per second. The other thing that you're going to want from this, especially with birds, right, when they have flapping wings, is the more frames per second you're using, the more poses you're going to have when it comes to your editing process, right? You're going to have a lot more photos to pick from. You'll have the bird with their wings going up, right? Then they'll be out and then they'll be down. And then there's always some poses kind of in between. I kind of like those three poses. I like when the wings are up, out, and kind of down because the wings look cool. But there's always poses somewhere in between there that look awkward. They just look crappy. It's not a good looking shot. And you're going to discard those, right? Very quickly. So having high frames per second is going to give you that option, though, to have all those different types of photos, all those different types of poses available to you that you can choose to pick from. Tip number 7, we talked about this in a recent video. We talked about exposure, and is there such thing as a perfect exposure? And as we answered the question, technically, no, there is no perfect exposure. The only perfect exposure is the exposure that you're looking to achieve based on the photo that you're looking to create. So don't be afraid, guys, to not have this perfectly lit, right, middle of the road, very vanilla exposure. Experiment with going a little bit brighter, and experiment with going a little bit darker. Create mood, create texture, depth, and dimension in your photos. I preach this all the time. But these things, right, changing your exposure, it's going to bring in more depth and texture and dimension into your photos, because as the photo gets darker, right, it's going to make some more of the textures in your photo stick out. Vice versa. If you're going lighter, it might remove some of the texture and depth and dimension in your photo, because that brighter light might wash some of that out. If you're using side lighting in those early morning shots, that side light can give you a lot of nice depth, texture, and dimension. Don't be afraid to go a little bit darker in that. Maybe one side of your bird or your animal is a little bit more in shadow and the other part is a little bit more in the bright light, right, where that sun is hitting it. That can create some really, really interesting photos and make your photos really dramatic. So experiment with your exposure. Don't be afraid to go to that darker side. Don't be afraid to go to that lighter side. Do what it takes to create, more interesting, dramatic images. This all goes along with the things that we've been talking about. Shoot wide, medium, tight. Vary your angles, vary your camera height, vary your exposures too. Tip number 8. This is going to kind of go back to tip number 2 when I was talking about being patient and being persistent, but look for interesting things happening. You might walk up to a scene. Maybe you walk up to some kind of lake or some kind of river or lagoon like I have here, or maybe you're just out in a field and you come across a bird and you see something living, you see something moving, and you want to photograph it, right? Slow down for a second. Take a look around you. Observe what's happening. Maybe you have a, kind of just an okay looking bird. Maybe you've photographed them 100 times before and they're sitting in the tree and your instinct is to photograph them again. But meanwhile, you failed to see the bird that was sitting in the water, across the pond from you or across the lake or wherever you are. And they're doing some kind of bathing ritual, and they're splashing and they're throwing up water, and you're getting water spray and you're getting all these interesting things. This happens when you're out there, right? We fall into these routines. We fall into these patterns. Don't forget when you walk upon a scene to be quiet, right? Be gentle. Observe what's going on around you, right? Don't make a lot of noise doing it. Just take your time, look around, see what's happening, see what's interesting, but don't miss these interesting moments. Look for birds playing in water. Look for birds, playing together. Look for maybe some quarrels going on between different species. These are all things that can create some really, really interesting photos. But I encourage you to just take a stop, take a breath for a second, stop and breathe for a second, look around for interesting moments. If there's nothing interesting going on as you photograph birds, maybe you're just taking some portraits, always keep an eye out for that next interesting moment. Look for a bird to land in the water. Look for birds to land in trees together. Maybe they're doing something. Listen with your ears, right? A lot of times you start hearing the squawking. Those can be dead giveaways that something is going on. Maybe a little fight between birds. Maybe there's a disagreement. Right? Something's going on that could be very interesting. So pay attention to these really unique and special moments going on all around you. Tip number 9, use a monopod or a tripod when you are out doing your photography. Now, if you do a combination of still photographs and video, I always recommend having a tripod on you, because when you switch to the video modes with your cameras, that is going to provide a much more stable base to get better video than if you're using a monopod. If you're just doing still photographs, then I recommend you have a monopod with a wildlife gimbal head on it. Makes you very portable, very mobile, and it's very easy to get a lot of great shots, but it also provides a lot of stabilization for still photographs. And now that, of course, is going to be very helpful, because this is going to allow you to play with your exposure, right? By playing with your shutter speed. Now, when you have that stability, if you're shooting in the darker morning, you're going to be able to slow that shutter speed down to 1/250 or 1/500, and you can get some good exposures on your animals, right? Because sometimes it's too dark in the very early morning hours, and you don't want to photograph them at 1/1000 or 1/2000 of a second. It's just going to make for really bright or really dark photos that you may not be able to recover. You're going to need to slow that shutter speed down. And if you're working at higher ISOs, like we often are in those darker situations, you're going to get much less noise if you can take a photo at 1/500th of a second as opposed to 1/2000th of a second, even with the same ISO value. We've talked about this in previous videos. So keep those things in mind. You want the stabilization so that you can play with your shutter speed. You can also experiment with flying birds, right? Slow your shutter speed down to maybe 1/500. Try to get and keep that camera on the high burst mode, right? Those high frames per second. But photograph a bird in flight. All you need are 1 or 2 photos with the eyes in perfect focus, even if the wings are blurry, right? It's going to create a really cool and dynamic looking photo. Go to 1/2500, right? Completely freeze the bird. These are all things that you can do when you have this monopod. You can vary your shutter speeds, and you can do these different things to create very different photos, more engaging photos. You can get some purposeful blur in your images, or you can freeze them completely. This is all up to you. You have the creative freedom to make that choice. But the point is without the monopod or the tripod, you're giving up your creative freedom, because now you can't handhold that lens at those slower shutter speeds when the bird is flying. Guarantee every photo is going to be blurry. It's just going to be the way it is. So get some stabilization, allow yourself some more creative freedom, and see what you can get. Hey guys, that is it for today. Those are the 9 tips for making your wildlife photos more creative. Did anything here help you? Did you find this useful? If you did, please consider subscribing to this channel, like the video, and hey, thanks for spending some time with me. I really appreciate it. Till the next time, best of luck out there while shooting your wildlife photos, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take care.